Hey everybody, welcome to the Mr. Movie Show. I'm Steve, and welcome. And on this episode, we're going to be discussing Spider-Man the animated series. Now, a couple months ago, Spider-Man No Way Home came out, and we decided to do a whole episode of Spider-Man in sort of media per se, and we kind of talked about Spider-Man 1, Spider-Man 2, Spider-Man 3, the Tobey Maguire years. We kind of brushed a little bit on Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends and Spider-Man the Animated Series. I decided to do this as sort of a part 2 where we can discuss Spider-Man, um, the Spider-Man Animated Series as sort of a film, as sort of another episode, and just kind of go into the first the first episode of the Spider-Man animated series. This is a solo podcast. Jay's not involved, so it's just gonna be me, and I'm just gonna kind of go through episode 1 for you. Spider-Man, the the series Spider-Man and Spider-Man the animated series debuted in November 19th of 1994 and lasted till January 31st, 1998. So it lasted for about um, 5 seasons, and it ran for about 65 episodes. And it sort of came out on Fox Kids in the 90s. It was kind of with sort of Marvel's 90s animated resurgence. I mean, we talked about how like this was sort of right after the whole, after Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends and the Spider-Man animated shows of the 70s. This was sort of the 90s cool thing. This kind of goes right around with the same time as X-Men. X-Men came out around 92 and lasted till about 97, the animated show on Fox, and this kind of came out in 94 and lasted till 98. So it sort of it ended a year after X-Men did. The Spider-Man. So this show pretty much is sort of, it kind of, from watching the first episode, it pretty much already sets up that he's already had his spider's abilities. He's going to college. He's working for J. Jonah Jameson. So they don't really go into, that much detail on the fact that he was a uh, gotten bitten by the spider and all that kind of stuff in the first episode. It's kind of in the same way as in Batman the animated series with the first episode of Man Bad, where they just sort of throw you into, they kind of skip all the origin stuff and just say, okay, he's been Spider-Man for a while. Here's he's been Spider-Man for a while. Here's what he's doing in the daily thing. This show, cause I kind of did some I like to do sort of like, did some research and stuff. This show, was directed by Bob Richardson. Bob Richardson's best known for directing, he directed Max Steel. He directed Rudy Dog and the Dweebs, a one season episode wonder about a dog with a pink Cadillac. The director also he's done a lot of animated Spider-Man stuff. He actually was a series director for Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. He did Spider-Woman. He did the Pink Panther, excuse me. The animated show, not the movie. And he did work on he was supervising executive producer for Max Steel. He worked on the Ultimate Avengers animated movie and Ultimate Avengers 2 animated movie. Um, then you had your cast was Christopher Daniel Barnes, who voiced Peter Parker. If that name doesn't sound familiar, but the voice does, he was the voice of Eric in The Little Mermaid. He was also in he also played Greg Brady in a very Brady sequel and the Brady Bunch movies. He did, according to his IMDb page, he played the voice of Prince Charming in Cinderella 2, Dreams Come True, and Cinderella 3, A Twist in Time. His other works, and this is very interesting, he was brought back to do voice work for Spider-Man in the video game section. He actually did voice work he played the voice of Spider-Man 2099 in Spider-Man Edge of Time. He did the voice as Spider-Man Noir in Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions. He did voice work for the Amazing Spider-Man 2 video game as Donald Meekin, and he was recently the voice of Spider-Man in Spider-Man Unlimited video game as Electro and Vulture, respectively. He also came back to do Prince Eric in Kingdom Hearts. So the voice, doing this research, I was like going, I knew that voice sounded familiar, and Spider-Man is actually Prince Eric. So there you go. Then you had the voice of Sarah Valente. Sarah Valente was the voice of Mary Jane Watson. Her other works include she was a nurse in Nutty Professor. She did work in Modern Family. She did voice work for Batman Year One. She was in episodes of Frasier, episodes of Sabrina the Teenage Witch, additional voice work for Totally Spies. She was in Third Rock. She played a teacher in Third Rock from the Sun. She was in episodes of Married with Children and episodes of Wings, Murphy Brown. And she did voice work for the real Ghostbusters. So there's her as Mary Jane. Then you had, surprisingly, the great late Edward Asner. If you don't know Edward Asner, he was in the Mary Tyler Moore Show. He played Santa in Elf with Will Ferrell. He was in. He was also Carl Flickley in Up. Recently, I saw him as Johnny's stepfather in Cobra Kai. And unfortunately, he passed away this past August. Then you had the voice of the Kingpin is Roscoe Lee Brown, who voiced the Kingpin. He has a deep voice. He's best known for he played the voice of Francis in Oliver and Company. He came back to Disney in the Treasure Planet movie, which Jay and I reviewed. He was the voice of Mr. Arrow. His other works include he was the narrator for Garfield 2. He was in episodes of Will and Grace, Static Shock, Law and Order, Wild Thornberrys, ER. But he's the voice of the Kingpin in this show. He was the narrator in Babe. And then you had Rodney Savery. Rodney Savery was did the voice work for. He was in The Bold and the Beautiful, where he played Anthony Walker. He was in episodes of Law and Order. He's had voice talents. He did voice work for Grand Theft Auto 5. He was in Monk. He was in episodes of Law and Order LA, which only lasted one season. He did voice work for All Grown Up, the Nickelodeon television show about the Rugrats who grow up. He's done voice work for video games such as the video game Scarface, video game CSI, video game for Grey's Anatomy, uh, the G.I. Joe video game. His other works include, um, let's see, he's also done All Real Monsters, Duckman. Look, he played a dog's voice, and look, he's talking now. And he was in Dr. Quinn's Medicine Women, just to name a few. Then you had Jennifer Haley, who was Felicia Hardy Black Cat. Um, she did voice work. She was a voice work for Cinderella in Wreck-It Ralph 2. She was in episodes of. Hold on. She did voice work for. She did voice work for Iron Man VR. She did the video game where she played the voice of Pepper Potts. And she voices Black Cat. And Aunt May, let's get Aunt May Parker, Linda Gray, who who passed away in '95, so she only lasts at 50. But she was the voice of Queen Marina for He-Man, Masters of the Universe, and she was voice of the grandmother in the Land Before Time series. So that's the cast, just to kind of give you like, hey, I know the voice. I'm surprised people know, because like Eric's was the voice of Eric. I just realized now that the voice of Eric is the voice of Spider-Man. Wow. So here we go with the first episode. So the first episode is entitled Night of the Lizard, and it starts out with Spider-Man doing a monologue about how New York City is so peaceful from up here. I wish it was as peaceful as it is down there. And we start with a bunch of workers working, and they're working on a they're working on the subway line. Is where it starts. So they get spooked by the lizard, and they end up getting into their van, and Spider-Man pretty much has to kind of come in and like save them. The lizard actually grabs one of the workers while he's trying to get into his car, but it doesn't work, and they end up going on a chase. Spider-Man sees it and thinks that the car is, going too fast, and he realizes, and they end up getting into the van keeps driving in through traffic, and he's trying to say, hit the brake, turn, and then the van ends up going off one of the bridges into the water, and Spider-Man has to save him. And so the driver was terrified, and he's like, the red eyes are all after me, and he's like, mm-hmm. And the driver is pretty much spooked about the eyes of what he saw in the subway, and Spider-Man thinks he's kind of like being sort of unserious about the whole thing. And then we go back to the Daily Bugle, where Peter Parker is working as a photographer, and he's talking to so Robbie and J. Jonah Jameson tell Peter to get photos of the lizard who's been out and about and terrorizing the city. And then we set up sort of the rivalry between Peter Parker and Eddie Brock, which is already established. And Eddie Brock is drawn a lot bigger into scale, and he says, they're talking about the lizard, and it's like, he's like, and Peter kind of says, like, sporadically, who in this city, who would notice a giant lizard? And Brock says, I'd notice, and, if you would be more here, you would know that that there would be there would be, you would know that there'd be a monster in the sewer. Peter thinks it's a wild goose chase, and J. Jonah Jameson tells him it's not a wild goose chase, and gives him a picture of the guy who is supposedly missing. So then what happens is that Eddie Brock says, I've made a list of these scientists that work on reptiles, and J. Jonah Jameson basically gives them a job, and then J. Jonah Jameson, or then he runs up the names of the scientists, and one of the names is Kurt Connors, which Peter Parker kind of says Kurt Connors is one of my professors. I would love to take him. I'd love to an interview with him. And since J. Jonah Jameson, or since Peter Parker knows Kurt Connors as his, close, J. Jonah Jameson gives him the interview to do. Peter Parker thinks that this whole lizard thing is a hoax. J. Jonah Jameson basically sweetens the deal by saying that anybody gives a picture of this lizard gets a $1,000 bonus, which prompts Spider-Man Peter Parker to go into action. And we also kind of see how, so he goes to see Aunt, because I guess he's still living with Aunt May, and Aunt May is still kind of, the kind of more of the grandmother look like we see in the kind of the way the comics are portrayed her. And he wants to get, I think if he gets paid with this, he can put a down payment on a car, and because we see him ride the bus, and while he gets there, Aunt May is looking at past due bills, and Peter asks her, so what's with the long face, and she says, nothing, Peter, and then he finds out that they are that she's got past due bills to pay, and so he's gonna make it right by kind of doing this for kind of giving the money that he'll make by selling the pictures to Aunt May. Because it's a $1,000 bonus that he'll get to do. So then Peter goes looking for Kurt Connors in the sewer, just like trying to find a Ninja Turtle. So Peter goes into the sewer. He finds paw prints of the lizard and takes a photo of it, and goes back to Empire State University with the photo. She asked him why he's here, and doesn't he have, like, when do you have night class? And he's like, knock. I'm here to show a photo to Kurt Connors. And so basically they go into the lab, and they find, they kind of get their lab coats on, and then Spider-Man's spider sense is tingling, and where he finds the lights go out, and Kurt Connors, who is now turning into the lizard, is sort of wrecking his own office right now. Deborah goes to see if Kurt Connors needs help, and she finds out he's been lizardized, and Kurt Connors, with his giant lizard tail, pours a bunch of books on Deborah, and then Peter thinks that the lizard has kidnapped Dr. Connors, but instead he has transformed into Dr. Connors. Or Dr. Connors has turned into the lizard, excuse me. He goes and he decides to try to chase Doc Connors, but ends up but Deborah tells him, Peter, don't leave me. I'm afraid, I'm scared, and he's kind of goes and comforts her. They flash back to a scene where Dr. Connors, who's still in human form, are working on radiation power to regrow arms on um, mice, and it works for the rats. Which, if you remember in Spider-Man, and in the comics, and in Spider-Man, um, the Amazing Spider-Man movie, we know that Kurt Connors doesn't have a right or left arm. So it has something to do with reps. This is sort of his origin on how he we flash back to how he kind of did for an origin get an new arm, and with the mouse that regains its arm is named Mickey, and Mickey like the mouse, and he's and just using the reptile DNA on the mice, it made the mice grow its arm back, and he kind of wants to use it on him. Kind of that's sort of the backstory of the lizard, and then so we get that sort of past thing, and then the story continues. Now Kurt Connors as the lizard as going back to his wife and son's house, and I'm guessing that they don't know that he has, or that they've been kind of estranged for a while. Spider-Man shows up in the Connors' residence, and she's like, "Stay away from him. Stay away from us. What do you want?" kind of thing. And he's like, "Easy, Mrs. Connors. I'm looking for the professor." And so basically, Kurt Connors as a lizard wants to see his family. Spider-Man is pretty much, making kind of wants to protect his family. Eddie Brock shows up and gets a ladder and wants to try to get a photo of the lizard, but the lizard shows up and scares him. And then Spider-Man shows up, but first, before he fights him, he decides to get a picture because he needs the photo for the Daily Bugle. But he drops his camera to the ground, and it's raining and it's wet, and he's like, "Well, there goes my $1,000 photo." And Spider-Man basically fight it out. Spider-Man still thinking that the lizard has something to do with, that he's like somehow like killed or kidnapped Kurt Connors. But apparently it is Kurt Connors as the lizard. His son Billy says, "Daddy, don't hurt him." And he's like, "Did I hear right? Like that this is actually Kurt Connors, and this is Kurt Connors' son?" And it's like, and basically he's like, "Daddy, don't." His mom says, "Yes, I just knew it was Kurt." And we have so then she's like, after Daddy, he's like, "Yeah, you heard right. It is Kurt Connors." Then it talks about how his hand, how he was using neogenetics to grow his hand, and we kind of see and flashback sort of how he become kind of the Frankenstein moment of him becoming the lizard. And it starts out with his hand, he grew his hand, but then all of a sudden the scales come out, and he starts to mutate into the lizard. Spider-Man's like, basically after she tells him that it's turned him into the lizard, he says, she said, "Why didn't you?" Peter Parker, Spider-Man says, "Why didn't you tell anybody?" And she was like, well, if I tell him, then they'll think that he's a freak and would want to experiment on him or something. So he keeps her secret as long as I can, and then we find out that Eddie Brock, who is hiding behind the bushes like a creep, and is writing the story, and he's like, "This is gold," and he says, "Once I kind of crack this, I'll win a Pulitzer." He decide Eddie Brock runs back to sort of his play, or back to the Daily Bugle, and Spider-Man kind of wraps him up and says, you can't, have Peter, or you can't, use this on Dr. Connors. Uh, Mrs. Connors, the wife of Dr. Connors, is kidnapped by the lizard and is thrown into the sewer, or there's taken to the sewer. And so he tracks him down in the sewer. Then we hear Peter quipping, kind of quipping / complaining about why he's in a sewer. Why can't he do? He kind of, there's some quips where he says stuff like, "You'll never see the Guardians of the Galaxy in the sewer, or the Defenders. Well, maybe the Hulk in the sewer, but he kind of has that quip." So he's looking for Dr. Connors, scared, and his wife Spider, he's more scared of the lizard than he's really letting on. But so he finds the lizard to save him from being the lizard to being his friend Kurt Connors. So so he finds where Mrs. Connors and the lizard are, and the lizard's like saying, well, here's my plan for the day. Ha 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 ha. He hears her. Spider-Man hears him. He falls down. He finds a manhole and falls down part of the sewer. And after he falls down the sewer, he finds out his webbing is losing its consistency because his web is breaking and he has to change cartridges. Here's something that's interesting, is that I feel like with Spider-Man and I think like this one, it's sort of the same thing, as he's got to have cartridges, like I think as Andrew Garfield and and Tom Holland does, and then Tobey Maguire has the fluid. So I think that's kind of interesting. So he falls and he finds Connors and his wife in his lair. And then he hears a faint sound of "Save me! Save me!" And it finds out that the lost lost subway worker is trapped in one of the sewer drains as a prisoner, and how he has had no food and no sleep, and then sort of his woman, Connors' wife, is yelling, and she asks him, "Why did you bring me here, Kurt?" And he says, "So we could be together." And I think his idea is, I think the reason is because I think he is a reptile-looking thing. He feels like the rest of the world will reject him, his looks. So she's like, "You're still my husband, and I love you." And she's like, "I love you, and we don't need to be kind of hanging out in the sewer. I love you for who you are, and we should go back to the surface." And he says, "But I need you to help me with this." And he gives her this sort of gigantic super ray that he needs her hands to help him with. And then so basically he wants her to become a lizard too, I guess. So the lizard's basic plan is to turn everyone into lizards so they can be like him, kind of thing. Which I think is the same plan that the lizard used in the Amazing Spider-Man movie with Andrew Garfield. So yeah, there. So Dr. Connors realized that he still has a son, and Spider-Man says, "Sorry, Bill. Sorry, Doc. I can't do this to you. I can't, let this happen." So he kicks him in the back, and uh, and so they start to have a fight and duke it out. And after they duke it out, they fight, and he uses his tail to knock him off, and she's like, "Connors, what are you doing?" Mrs. Connors takes the device, and he's like, "Mrs. Connors, what are you doing with the device?" But Spider-Man webs the lizard's ankles, and he accidentally hits his wife Margaret with his tail, which brings the super gun onto teetering off a sewer pipe, and the lizard Kurt Connors feels so bad that he hit his wife that he's like, "Margaret, what did I do?" So Spider-Man takes the opportunity to take the device and turn it on, but the lizard basically sees it, lunges at him, and they fall into the sewer together. And then there's this huge underwater fight, and he basically fights him off, and he's like, he's kind of dealing with the fact that it's just kind of strange that that a week ago, that how he was so human a week ago, and now he's turned into this monster. It's this Frankenstein, Dracula, Wolfman kind of thing that he's going with. But Spider-Man turns on the device in the water, which gives this huge electric fuse and brings up this big giant red water in the air scene, where water transforming and Kurt Connors back to his human self again. So that's kind of how it happened. So she's like, "Kurt, is he okay? Will he survive?" And they're like going, "Yes, he'll be okay." First, Spider-Man Peter Parker has to get his phone or his camera, and basically gets his camera, and then to show up Eddie Brock at the Daily Bugle that he got the picture of the lizard. So Eddie Brock wants to show J. Jonah Jameson that he has the scoop of the lizard, and and then you find out that, and then J. Jonah Jameson says, "Peter Parker already brought me the photos, so there's nothing really for me to show you." But he's like, "Yes, let me show you. And you find out that it wasn't that, since Dr. Connors is now cured, it's just him with his family and being like, "Hey, J. Jonah Jameson, how are you doing today?" kind of thing. And Peter basically shows Aunt May that he got a lot of money through that he got a lot of money through the Daily Bugle for getting photos of Spider-Man. Aunt May sort of still isn't a big fan of Spider-Man, I think. And I think in the comics she wasn't a big fan. Like, she kind of wasn't a big fan of Spider-Man. She thinks he's a horrible menace to society kind of thing. So she asks Peter how he got that photo, and he said, "Well," and he doesn't have an excuse, and she's like, "Well, you must have been down there in the sewer trying to get photos of Spider-Man," and she's like, "You need to get a cold, you'll be, that weather will damp, it'll make you that atmosphere is damp, it'll make you sick." And she's like, the episode ends where she's like, you need to go take a bath and hot soup, and the episode ends with him going to kind of swinging back, and the episode ends. So that's the first episode of the Spider-Man 1994 series. I liked it. I thought it was a pretty good, intro to the character. It didn't really, it kind of already like in Batman the Animated Series, it already established that Spider-Man is Spider-Man. It gives us a pretty good, interesting look at Kirk Connors and his family, and kind of, it's pretty easy. I mean, it's only 22 minutes long, so it's sort of, it's a good episode. I liked it. I give it a 84 out of 100. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe.